The planet PX-771 hung in the viewport, a swirling haze of pale green clouds wrapping around jagged mountain ranges and vast oceans of rust-colored water. Commander Eliza Mercer leaned forward in her chair, the straps of her harness digging into her shoulders as the shuttle began its descent through the atmosphere. "Hard to believe this place is uncharted," Lieutenant Carson muttered from the co-pilot's seat. His voice was light, but his hands were tight on the controls. "Uncharted doesn't mean untouched," Dr. Arun Malik said, his voice measured. The xenobiologist sat behind them, his tablet glowing faintly as he reviewed satellite scans. The atmosphere's oxygen levels, the ecosystem. There's no way this planet hasn't hosted life at some point. Mercer didn't respond, her eyes locked on the ground below as it came into view. Jagged cliffs rose like skeletal remains from a barren expanse of rock, their edges sharp and unnatural. Beyond them, a structure stretched toward the sky, black and gleaming under the alien sun. "Is that—" Carson started but trailed off. "The Spire," Mercer said. The Spire was their mission. Orbiting satellites had picked up faint signals emanating from the structure, signals that had defied human understanding. Its sheer size, over 3 miles tall, made it visible from space, a monolithic needle piercing the atmosphere. No known civilization, earthly or otherwise, could have built it. The shuttle landed roughly a mile from the Spire's base, the engines kicking up a storm of greenish dust that clung to the hull like ash. As the ramp lowered, Mercer felt a wave of heat hit her, far hotter than the readings had predicted. She adjusted the seal on her helmet and stepped onto the surface, her boots crunching against the brittle ground. The Spire loomed in the distance, its surface unnaturally smooth and black, absorbing rather than reflecting light. Even from this distance, it radiated an oppressive energy, as though it were alive and watching. "It doesn't look constructed," Carson said, his voice piped through their comms. "It looks grown." Mercer glanced at Malik, who had knelt to examine the ground. He scooped a sample into a vial, his movements precise and methodical. "Commander, the soil here is laced with organic material. This isn't rock, it's fossilized." "Fossilized?" Mercer repeated. Malik nodded, standing and brushing his gloves off. "This entire plane might have been alive once. Whatever built that spire, it's connected to the biology of this planet." As they approached, the ground beneath their feet became spongy, almost fleshy. Carson grimaced, his boot sinking slightly with each step. "Tell me that's just my imagination." "It's not," Malik said. He had stopped a few feet ahead, staring at the spire's surface. Up close, it was even stranger, smooth but slightly translucent, as though something inside was moving. Pulses of faint bluish light coursed through the structure, following no discernible pattern. "It's warm," Malik murmured, reaching out to touch it. "Don't," Mercer snapped, but it was too late. The moment Malik's glove made contact, a low hum filled the air. It wasn't a sound so much as a vibration, deep and resonant, that seemed to pass through their bones. Mercer's vision blurred, and for a fleeting second she saw something impossible. A vast, alien landscape stretching endlessly in all directions, filled with towering shapes like the spire. She stumbled back, gasping. Carson was on his knees, clutching his head. Malik remained frozen, his hand still on the spire, his eyes wide and unfocused. "Malik!" Mercer shouted, grabbing his shoulder and pulling him away. The moment his hand broke contact, the hum stopped. The oppressive silence that followed was somehow worse. I saw it," Malik whispered, his voice trembling. "Saw what?" Mercer demanded. "The spire," he said, turning to her. "There's more than one. This isn't just a building, it's a network." Mercer opened her mouth to respond, but a sharp cry from Carson cut her off. He had stumbled a few feet back, his helmet tilted upward. "Commander, look," he said. Mercer turned to follow his gaze. The spire's surface was changing, small sections rippling like disturbed water. A seam appeared, widening slowly, revealing an opening large enough to walk through. "That's not an invitation," Mercer said, but she knew better. The spire was awake, and whatever it wanted, they were already inside its grasp. Inside the spire, the air was thick, almost liquid, and the walls emitted a faint glow that seemed to pulse in time with their heartbeats. The tunnel stretched endlessly, its smooth, undulating surface devoid of any markings or seams. "It's like we're inside a body," Carson muttered, his voice tight. "No comparison," Malik said, his eyes scanning the walls. "This is beyond biology. It's engineered life, purposeful but not natural." As they moved deeper, the light grew brighter, revealing strange skeletal remains embedded in the walls. They were twisted, elongated, and fused together in grotesque shapes, as though the spire had absorbed them into itself. "What the hell are those?" Carson asked, his voice rising. "Victims," Malik said softly. "Whatever lived here, they didn't build the spire. They became part of it." A chill ran down Mercer's spine, but she forced herself to focus. "We gather what data we can and get out. No heroics." But as they reached the end of the tunnel, they stepped into a vast chamber that defied comprehension. The walls pulsed with light, and in the center was a massive cocoon-like structure, suspended by tendrils that seemed to pulse with life. The hum returned, louder and more insistent, and Mercer felt her vision blur again. "Commander," Malik said, his voice trembling, "I think it's waking up." The chamber's pulsating walls seemed to breathe, their bioluminescent patterns casting shifting shadows over the team. Commander Eliza Mercer stared at the cocoon-like structure in the center of the room, her pulse racing. The low hum had returned, a resonant vibration that made the air feel thick and heavy. "What is it?" Carson asked, his voice barely a whisper. He stood at Mercer's side, his rifle raised, though the weapon felt insignificant against whatever this thing was. Dr. Aaron Malik stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the cocoon. The tendrils connecting it to the walls pulsed rhythmically, carrying an iridescent fluid that glowed faintly. "It's alive," he said, his voice trembling. "But not in any way we understand. This isn't just biology, it's architecture, engineered to grow and evolve." Mercer tightened her grip on her rifle, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. "Can it hear us?" Malik hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't think so, but it's reacting to us. Every step we take, every sound we make, it's adapting." The hum grew louder, and Mercer motioned for the team to move deeper into the spire. They stepped carefully, their boots squelching against the organic floor. The air grew warmer as they entered another tunnel, the walls narrowing as if the spire itself was guiding them somewhere. "It's like it's alive," Carson muttered, his voice shaky. "It is alive," Malik replied. He ran a gloved hand along the wall, which rippled beneath his touch. "This entire structure, it's one organism, a living system." Mercer didn't like how the walls seemed to shift as they walked, their movements subtle but unmistakable. It was as if the spire was leading them, or herding them. They emerged into another chamber, smaller than the last, but no less unsettling. The walls were lined with what appeared to be pods, each one large enough to hold a human. Some were translucent, revealing grotesque shapes within. Mercer approached one, her breath catching as she saw the skeletal remains of an alien creature inside. Its limbs were elongated and fused, its skull warped as though it had been reshaped. "They were part of this," Malik said, examining another pod. "Whoever, or whatever, they were, the spire absorbed them." Carson stepped back, his face pale. "Why? Why would it do that?" Malik didn't answer immediately. He studied the pod, his brow furrowed. "This isn't just a structure, it's a process. The spire isn't just a building, it's a factory." "A factory for what?" Mercer asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. Malik turned to her, his expression grim. "For transformation. It repurposes life. Whatever comes into contact with this place, it rewrites it." Mercer felt a wave of nausea. The skeletal remains in the pods weren't just victims, they were experiments, molded into something new and alien. "Commander," Carson called from the far side of the chamber. His voice was tight with panic. "You need to see this." Mercer and Malik hurried to his side. Carson stood near a pod that was different from the others, larger and more opaque. The shape inside wasn't alien. It was human. "Is that—" Mercer began, but her words faltered. The figure in the pod was a man, his body partially fused with the organic walls. His skin was mottled with black, veiny growths, and his arms were twisted into grotesque, claw-like appendages. His face, though distorted, was still recognizable. "It's Torres," Carson whispered. Mercer's stomach dropped. Lieutenant Torres had been part of the scouting team sent ahead of their arrival. They had lost contact with him days ago, his last transmission garbled and frantic. "What the hell happened to him?" Carson asked, his voice rising. "The spire happened," Malik said, his tone heavy. "It's rewriting him, breaking him down and building him into something else." A sudden noise froze them in place, a wet, slithering sound that echoed through the chamber. Mercer raised her rifle, her eyes scanning the room. "What was that?" Carson whispered. The noise grew louder, closer. From the far end of the chamber, something emerged, a mass of twisted limbs and sinew, its form barely recognizable as humanoid. It moved awkwardly, its elongated arms dragging along the ground as it lurched forward. Mercer's breath caught as she realized what it was. "It's Torres," she said, her voice hollow. The thing that had once been Torres let out a guttural, inhuman cry, its head jerking unnaturally as if struggling against its own body. The black veins covering its skin pulsed with light, the same eerie glow that coursed through the walls. "Stay back!" Mercer shouted, but the creature lunged, its movements impossibly fast. Carson fired first, his rifle cracking in the confined space. The bullets tore into the creature's flesh, but it barely slowed. Mercer and Malik joined in, their shots echoing through the chamber. The creature fell to the ground, twitching violently before going still. Mercer approached cautiously, her rifle trained on its mangled body. Black fluid seeped from its wounds, pooling on the floor. "It's still alive," Malik said, his voice trembling. Mercer looked down at the creature. Its eyes, if they could still be called that, blinked slowly, filled with a mix of pain and something else. Recognition. "Kill it," Carson said, his voice breaking. "It's not him anymore. It's not Torres." Mercer hesitated for only a moment before pulling the trigger. The creature's body convulsed once, then went still. The chamber fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the spire. "We need to leave," Carson said, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here right now." Mercer didn't respond immediately. She looked at Malik, whose face was pale but determined. "We can't," Malik said. "Not yet. We need to understand what this place is and how to stop it." Mercer nodded reluctantly, though every instinct screamed at her to retreat. "We keep moving," she said, her voice firm, "but we stay together. No one goes off alone." As they entered the next tunnel, the spire seemed to respond, its walls pulsing more brightly, the hum growing louder. The air grew warmer, and Mercer felt a strange tingling sensation in her limbs. She glanced at Malik, whose hands were trembling. "Are you feeling that?" He nodded, his jaw clenched. "It's the spire. It's getting inside us." Mercer didn't respond. She tightened her grip on her rifle and pressed forward, knowing there was no turning back. Whatever the spire was, it wasn't finished with them yet. The chamber stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of glowing walls and twisting passages that defied logic. Commander Eliza Mercer felt her breath catch as she surveyed the carvings etched into the spire's walls. Alien symbols, intricate and geometric, spiraled outward in patterns that seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light. The hum had become louder, resonating through their bones with each step. Dr. Aaron Malik knelt near one of the carvings, tracing its grooves with a trembling hand. His face was pale, beads of sweat collecting on his brow. "These aren't just symbols," he said, his voice hushed. "They're instructions." "Instructions for what?" Mercer asked, though her gut already churned with unease. "For transformation," Malik replied. He looked up, his eyes wide with realization. "This place, it's not a building or even a machine. It's a living system. It's designed to take organisms and repurpose them." "Repurpose them into what?" Lieutenant Carson interjected, his voice sharp with fear. Malik hesitated, then gestured to the walls. "This is a blueprint for creating something entirely new. The spire doesn't just assimilate life, it uses it as raw material to sustain itself. It turns anything it touches into part of its ecosystem." Mercer felt the weight of his words settle over her like a shroud. The skeletal remains they'd found in the pods, the grotesque creatures they'd encountered, all of it had been leading to this. The spire wasn't just a trap, It was a process. As they moved deeper into the chamber, the carvings became more detailed, depicting scenes that sent shivers down Mercer's spine. One wall showed towering figures, alien beings with elongated limbs and distorted faces. They stood before the spire, their forms gradually merging with it, their bodies dissolving into streams of light and matter. "It's showing us what happened to them," Malik said, his voice tinged with awe. "This species must have created the spire, but they lost control. It consumed them, transforming their civilization into this organism." Carson swore under his breath. "Why the hell would they build something like this?" "To survive," Malik replied. "Or at least, that was the intent. They must have thought they could use the spire to adapt, to evolve. But the spire didn't stop. It kept growing, consuming everything in its path. And now it's found us." Mercer clenched her fists, her mind racing. "So we're just fuel for this thing?" Malik nodded grimly. "If we stay here, yes. It's already started working on us. The air, the light. It's all part of the process. It's breaking us down, preparing us for assimilation." A sudden noise cut through the oppressive hum, a wet, slithering sound that echoed through the chamber. Mercer raised her rifle, signaling the others to be ready. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Sergeant Lee, or rather, what was left of him. His body was twisted and deformed, his limbs elongated and covered in black, chitinous growths. His face was barely recognizable, his features stretched and warped, as though the spire had tried to reshape him but hadn't finished. "Lee," Mercer said, her voice trembling. He turned toward her, his eyes glazed and unfocused. His mouth opened, but instead of words, a low, guttural sound emerged, like the echo of the spire's hum. He staggered forward, his movements jerky and unnatural. "Stay back!" Carson shouted, his rifle trained on the creature. Lee let out a piercing screech and lunged. Carson fired, the bullets tearing into his former comrade's body. Lee fell to the ground, convulsing as black fluid seeped from his wounds. But even as he lay there, his body continued to change, his flesh bubbling and twisting as though trying to rebuild itself. "It's still connected to the spire," Malik said, his voice shaking. "It's using him as an extension of itself." Mercer stepped forward, raising her rifle. She fired a single shot into Lee's head, silencing him for good. The chamber fell into an uneasy quiet, the hum now a low, menacing thrum. "We're running out of time," Mercer said, her voice firm. "If we don't stop this thing, we'll all end up like him. Or worse." Malik nodded, his expression grim. "The spire isn't just a threat to us. If it's allowed to grow unchecked, it could spread beyond this planet. It's not just consuming life, it's rewriting it on a planetary scale." The realization hit Mercer like a blow. The spire wasn't just a trap for unwitting explorers. It was a mechanism for terraforming, a process designed to convert entire worlds into extensions of itself. As they pressed deeper into the spire, the walls became more animated, the pulsing light growing stronger. The air grew warmer, and Mercer felt a tingling sensation in her skin. She glanced at Malik, whose hand trembled as he wiped sweat from his brow. "It's affecting us," she said. "It's accelerating," Malik replied, his voice tight. The closer we get to the core, the stronger its influence becomes. They reached a massive chamber, its center dominated by an enormous, pulsating structure. It resembled a heart, its black-veined surface glowing with an otherworldly light. Tendrils extended from it, connecting to the walls and ceiling, pumping the iridescent fluid that seemed to power the spire. "This is it," Malik said, his voice barely audible. "The core." Before Mercer could respond, the tendrils began to move, snaking toward them with deliberate, predatory intent. "Move," she shouted, firing at the tendrils as they lashed out. The bullets tore into them, but they quickly regenerated, the wounds sealing as though they had never been. The tendrils wrapped around Carson's legs, yanking him off his feet. He screamed, his body convulsing as the fluid seeped into his skin, his veins darkening as the transformation began. "Help me," he cried, but it was too late. His body twisted and contorted, merging with the tendrils as they pulled him toward the core. Mercer grabbed Malik's arm, pulling him back as the tendrils closed in. "We have to destroy it," she said, her voice fierce. "How?" Malik asked, panic in his eyes. "We find a way," Mercer replied, "or we die trying." The core pulsed violently, the hum rising to a deafening crescendo. The spire was awake, and it wasn't going to let them leave alive. The core chamber pulsed with an intensity that made the air ripple, as if the spire itself were breathing harder, faster. Commander Eliza Mercer stood at the edge of the massive, veined structure, the glowing black heart of the spire towering above her. The tendrils that connected it to the walls writhed like serpents, their movements erratic and predatory. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere left to go. Dr. Aaron Malik knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he armed the last of their explosive charges. Sweat poured down his face, and his breaths came in shallow gasps. "These charges won't be enough," he said, his voice hoarse. "The core, it's too vast. It's regenerating faster than we can damage it." Mercer gripped her rifle tightly, her jaw clenched. "We don't have a choice. If we don't stop this thing here, it'll consume everything. Us, this planet, maybe more." Malik looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "You don't understand. The spire isn't just alive, it's awake. It knows what we're trying to do." As if in response, the core let out a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through their bodies. The walls of the chamber glowed brighter, and the tendrils lashed out with renewed vigor. One of them wrapped around Malik's leg, dragging him toward the core. He screamed, clawing at the ground, but the tendril was too strong. "Arun!" Mercer shouted. She fired at the tendril, the bullets ripping into its flesh. Black fluid sprayed across the floor, and the tendril recoiled, releasing Malik. He scrambled to his feet, limping as he moved closer to the core. "We have to finish this," he shouted. "I'll arm the manual detonator. You just need to get out." "I'm not leaving you," Mercer said, her voice firm. "You don't have a choice," Malik snapped, his face twisted with pain. "If one of us doesn't stay, this thing will keep regenerating. Someone has to make sure it dies." Mercer hesitated, her heart pounding. She wanted to argue, but deep down she knew he was right. She grabbed his shoulder, her eyes locking onto his. "You're a better man than I am," she said quietly. Malik forced a weak smile. "Then don't waste the chance I'm giving you." Before she could respond, the core convulsed violently, its surface splitting open to reveal an enormous glowing cavity. Inside, Mercer glimpsed something horrifying, pulsating, half-formed shapes, their features twisted and incomplete. She realized with a sickening jolt that they were remnants of the Spire's victims, their bodies broken down and repurposed into raw material. "It's feeding," Malik whispered, his voice filled with dread. The tendrils lashed out again, more of them this time. Malik turned to the detonator, his fingers moving frantically as he entered the final sequence. Mercer covered him, firing at the tendrils as they closed in, but there were too many. One of them struck her, sending her sprawling to the ground. Her rifle skittered out of reach. "Go!" Malik shouted, his voice rising above the cacophony of the Spire's hum. "Get out of here, now!" Mercer scrambled to her feet, her body screaming in protest. She didn't want to leave him, but she knew staying would doom them both. With a final, desperate glance at Malik, she turned and ran. The tunnel leading out of the core chamber was collapsing, the walls twisting and closing in as the Spire tried to trap her. Mercer pushed herself harder, ignoring the pain that tore through her body. Behind her, she heard the core let out a deafening roar, the sound of something ancient and primal. She didn't look back. As she reached the surface, she felt the ground tremble beneath her. The Spire's hum had reached a fever pitch, the entire structure shaking violently. She threw herself behind a jagged rock just as the explosion tore through the air. The detonation was blinding, a wave of fire and light that consumed the Spire and everything around it. The shockwave knocked Mercer off her feet, and for a moment there was nothing but ringing silence. When she opened her eyes, the Spire was gone. All that remained was a smoking crater, the ground scorched and lifeless. The hum had finally stopped. Mercer forced herself to her feet, her body aching with every movement. She staggered to the edge of the crater, her heart heavy. Malik was gone. He had given everything to stop the Spire, and she hadn't even been able to say goodbye. But as she stood there, staring into the void, she felt a faint vibration beneath her boots. Her breath caught, and she dropped to her knees, pressing her hand against the ground. The vibration was faint but unmistakable, a rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "No, it can't be." From the edge of the crater, a small tendril emerged, black and glistening. It twitched once, then twice, before retreating into the earth. Mercer stared at the spot, her mind racing. The Spire wasn't dead. It had merely retreated, biding its time. She staggered back, her chest tight with panic. Humanity hadn't won. They had only delayed the inevitable. In the distance, the horizon shimmered faintly, a series of spires beginning to rise from the earth. The transformation had already begun. Mercer fell to her knees, her vision blurring with tears. There was no escape, no victory. The Spire's purpose had been fulfilled, and soon there would be nothing left of the world she had fought so hard to protect. The last sound she heard was the hum, faint but growing, as the Spire's reach spread across the planet.